Good. Well, thank you very much for your welcome. It's very good to be here and just talk on this topic of Richard Dawkins' approach to the relationship between science and religion, and indeed this whole question of the meaning of life. I personally first came across Richard Dawkins' writings back in 1977. And as many of you will know, that was the year after he published his first book, The Selfish Gene, which I read while I was doing research with George Rader in Oxford on various aspects of molecular biophysics. And I have to say, I found it a splendid read. It was well written, it was entertaining, it was stimulating, and a great read in many ways, far better than, for example, Jacques Monod's book, Chance and Necessity, which had appeared about 4 years earlier. But one of the things I noticed in reading it was that there were some rather puzzling references to religion in the book. And I felt that these really perhaps needed following through, and assumed, of course, somebody else would do it, and left it. But in the meantime, of course, Dawkins has produced a series of important writings. The first of them you will know well, The Selfish Gene, which really established his name. He followed this through by expanding this somewhat in Extended Phenotype. The Blind Watchmaker, I think possibly the work that really established him as a critic of religion, particularly in relation to whether God has any role in the whole idea of evolution. River Out of Eden, a very popular exploration of a Darwinian worldview. Climbing Mount Improbable. Unweaving the Rainbow, taking a slightly different trajectory, looking at some cultural issues. More recently, of course, The Devil's Chaplain, and then this year, The Ancestor's Tale. So a very significant body of work. And I hope in this lecture to range over, in fact, as much of this as we possibly can. So I need to begin by explaining to you what I hope to do in this lecture. Clearly, I have an hour, and there is a limit to what you can do in that amount of time. So what I propose to do is very simply this. Let me make it clear. I am not here to evaluate or assess Richard Dawkins' science. That's very, very clearly the province of the scientific community as a whole. What I want to explore is the connection between the science he develops and his atheism. And I want to raise some questions about whether this linkage is actually as secure, as well-grounded, as Dawkins himself seems to think. So what I really want to do is begin to lay out before you what Dawkins says, and then to try and explore in a little bit of detail some of the issues that arise from this. Now, as you can tell from that, I should be adopting a generally critical tone towards Dawkins, and therefore I think I must begin this lecture by saying in what respects I admire and respect him, because clearly I do. I admire him, first of all, because he is such a clear writer. He has a genius for expressing difficult ideas in very lucid prose with engaging analogies which really hold the reader's attention. And I think that's a very significant gift, and certainly it is to be noted and to be honored. Secondly, I very much admire and respect his concern to promote evidence-based thinking. Throughout his writings, we find this constant demand that statements should be justified. Why do you believe this? Where is this coming from? The need to really produce evidence to back up statements. This, of course, leads Dawkins to portray religious people in a generally very negative light. He very often represents them as dishonest, liars, fools, and knaves, incapable of responding honestly to the real world. And that, I think, is probably on a good day. And I think one of the questions I hope to explore a little bit is where this hostility comes from. There are many scientists who are atheists, who in effect are quite happy to say, well, I'm an atheist, they aren't, and that's the way things are, and I'm happy about that. But Dawkins is much more aggressive, much more concerned about this. And so I hope to be able to look at why this is in the course of this lecture. So let's begin to look at Dawkins' general criticisms of religion. And I've grouped these together under 4 broad headings. I think that you could possibly add additional ones, but this seems to me to be a useful way of summarizing or linking together the various themes I find throughout his writings. And the first of these is probably the most fundamental, namely, a Darwinian worldview makes belief in God unnecessary or, more likely in his view, impossible. Although we find this hinted at in his first book, The Selfish Gene, we find this idea developed in detail in The Blind Watchmaker. Secondly, Dawkins points out or argues that religion makes assertions which are grounded in faith, and this, he argues, represents a retreat from a rigorous, evidence-based concern for truth. For Dawkins, truth is grounded in explicit proof, and any form of obscurantism or mysticism grounded in faith is to be opposed vigorously, a very important aspect of his thought. Thirdly, he argues, I think especially in Unweaving the Rainbow, that religion offers an impoverished, an attenuated vision of the world. And here's a quote from Unweaving the Rainbow. The universe presented by organized religion is a poky little medieval universe and extremely limited. And his argument is that, in contrast, science offers a bold and brilliant vision of the universe as grand, beautiful, and awe-inspiring, whereas religion, he argues, simply detracts from that. Now, those first three grounds, I would say, are broadly speaking scientific. The fourth isn't. It's a slightly different approach. This is the argument that religion leads to evil. It's like a malignant virus, to pick up a theme we'll explore in a few moments, infecting human minds. And I think it is important to realize this is a different category of argument. Dawkins himself is very, very clear that science has no methods for deciding what is ethical. But of course, this objection is deeply rooted in Western culture. And here I think Dawkins is echoing a theme which we find in many atheist critics of religion down the ages. So those are four broad concerns we find throughout his writings. For the purposes of this lecture, I hope to look at 5 general issues which I see as being significant. And to set them out very briefly before we actually begin to engage with them, they are as follows. First of all, we want to look at that approach set out in The Blind Watchmaker and ask whether it actually does indeed impel us towards atheism. Secondly, Dawkins asserts that religious faith, I quote, means blind trust in the absence of evidence, even in the teeth of evidence. And that, of course, he argues, is inconsistent with the scientific method. We want to look at that. Thirdly, Dawkins develops from 1977 onwards this very powerful idea that in some way God is a supreme example of what he calls a mean. We'll explain what that is presently, but basically the argument is that people believe in God not because of the reliability of that judgment evidentially, but rather because there is a cultural replicator which is particularly efficient. And therefore belief in God is not due to intellectual persuasion, but to some form of cultural evolution. Fourthly, the point he makes so clearly in Unweaving the Rainbow, that religion impoverishes our understanding of religion, of the world. And I want to ask whether that is actually so, and of course, what evidence is offered in order to support that judgment. And finally, to try and ask why, in Dawkins' view, is religion such a bad thing? And above all, what evidence might be brought forth in defense of that particular viewpoint? So having set out the structure of the lecture, we'll move on and begin to look at. And we're beginning, of course, by looking at some themes that we find in The Blind Watchmaker. And the point that Dawkins makes very effectively in a whole series of books, this quotation, of course, is from River Out of Eden, is that if Darwinism is true, or at least if Dawkins' take on Darwinism is true, then we should expect the universe to be without purpose. As you can see from that quotation, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. It's a very austere viewpoint, but of course, austerity is no guarantee either of truth or falsity. Dawkins' point is simply this is the way it is, and therefore it must be respected for that. And Dawkins argues that the evolutionary process brings about outcomes which might seem to the uninitiated as possessing the, I quote, illusion of design. And Dawkins argues that this illusion of design arises because we intuitively regard structures as being too complex to have arisen by chance. And of course, an excellent example is provided by the human eye. Those of you who've read William Paley will know that for Paley, back at the beginning of the 19th century, the human eye was the supreme demonstration that the human body had been consciously, intelligently designed. And Dawkins gives a rather splendid discussion of how that rather complex structure could have come about by natural selection. Now, in many ways, what Dawkins offers us in The Blind Watchmaker, and indeed Climbing Mount Improbable, is standard Darwinism. But what I think is new is both the lucidity of his presentation and also his interest in developing the religious side of this. The word God, if you check it up, is absent from the index of The Blind Watchmaker, precisely because he is absent from the Darwinian world that Dawkins inhabits and commends. And the basic point that Dawkins makes is that on the basis of a Darwinian view of life, atheism is the only credible option for someone taking that viewpoint. There's a further statement of that viewpoint about the meaning of design. The question I want to ask is this: why does this actually lead to atheism? If anything, it seems to me, it simply leads to agnosticism. The key point here is that Dawkins, I think, has shown that there is no need to involve God at all in the explanatory process that we call the natural sciences. And that point, of course, was made by Thomas Aquinas back in the 13th century. Aquinas, as you will know, developed a theory of secondary causality, which allowed the regularity and investigability of the world to be maintained, but seeing God as one step removed. Therefore, one could understand the mechanisms of the world without actually needing to study God at all. But Dawkins is quite clear that agnosticism is not an acceptable stopping point, that the arguments impel us to atheism, not to agnosticism. And really it's that aspect of this which I want to discuss in this lecture, because it seems to me to be rather troubling and open to challenge a number of points. I want to raise a number of issues, some of which I fear I must simply touch on and then pass on due to limits of time. The first point I want to make is simply this, that at the most general level, the scientific method is actually incapable of adjudicating the God hypothesis either positively or negatively. In other words, that there is really a serious issue here about the limits of scientific knowledge. There are indeed those who will argue that the sciences move us in the direction of faith, just as there's those who will argue us that science moves us away from any kind of religious faith. But those are judgments built upon the scientific evidence, not judgments necessitated by it. I think it's very important to look, for example, at what T.H. Huxley, famously known as Darwin's bulldog, said back in 1880, after becoming utterly exasperated with what seemed to him to be rather intemperate, but also rather sterile debates in relation to science and the question of God. And he talks about why it was that he invented this term agnostic, which of course is still with us. And you notice that he uses the word to refer to people such as himself, who were hopelessly ignorant concerning a variety of matters about which metaphysicians and theologians, both orthodox and heterodox, dogmatize with utmost confidence. And Huxley intimates that he is actually just fed up with this and would very much like to move on, and in effect simply argues that this God question cannot be settled on the basis of a scientific method. And therefore, in fact, for Huxley, the proper outcome is simply agnosticism. Here is what he says. Many of you will know this very well. Agnosticism, he writes, is of the essence of science. It simply means that a man shall not say he knows or believes that which he has no scientific grounds for professing that he knows or believes. Consequently, look at the conclusion. Agnosticism puts aside not only the greater part of popular theology, but also the greater part of anti-theology. So the question I'm really raising is, why atheism? Why not simply agnosticism and saying there might be a faith outcome, there might be an atheist outcome, but we cannot actually decide? Moving on to someone who's written on this recently, Stephen Jay Gould, who died recently, back in 1990 got involved in a very significant argument about whether Darwinism was necessarily atheistic. A very important argument, I think, in relation to the question we're just discussing. And Gould invokes the memory of his third-grade teacher, Mrs. McInerney, as you will see, who was in the habit of rapping young knuckles when their owners said or did particularly stupid things. And here is what he is saying. He's saying simply, this is something we cannot really adjudicate on. We simply, as you see in the final sentence, can't comment on it as science. If some of our crowd have made some untoward statements claiming that Darwinism disproves God, then I will find Mrs. McInerney and have their knuckles rapped for as long as she can eat, as long as it takes. And then she goes on and makes the point, sorry, a line has dropped out there. She basically would be asked to do this also to those who argue that Darwinism must be God's method of action. The point that he is making here is simply that whether you press the sciences in an atheist direction or in a Christian direction, you're actually pressing them rather beyond acceptable limits. Gould then makes this point, based on simply enumerating evolutionary biologists he knows, some of whom were atheists, some of whom were Christians. And he simply makes this point. Either half my colleagues are enormously stupid, or else the science of Darwinism is fully compatible with conventional religious beliefs and equally compatible with atheism. In other words, it impels you to neither, but you can kind of work both around your science. So that's a question I want to raise, really. It seems to me there are some very interesting questions there. Dawkins, in effect, urges us to not pause at agnosticism, but continue to atheism. I'm not sure that's actually merited by his arguments. And again, a second problem, which I haven't time to develop tonight, is that Dawkins' arguments really lead us to the conclusion that God need not be invoked directly as an explanatory agent within the evolutionary process. But from the 13th century, Christian theologians would agree with that. It's equally consistent with atheism, agnosticism, and Christian readings of the world. So again, why must it be atheism? A third point, which if I had time I would want to talk about in much greater detail, is the title of the book itself, The Blind Watchmaker. There's a reference here to William Paley, a very interesting late 18th century writer who in effect put up this idea of God as a watchmaker. And the point I just need to make simply as a matter of history is that this model of God's activity is not typical of the Christian tradition, but actually emerges during the 18th century in response to the development of the Newtonian worldview, initially in relation to the physical sciences, but then through Paley being redirected to the biological sciences. Now clearly, much more needs to be said, but I'm simply flagging up some issues, and I need to move on. The second major theme I want to explore is Dawkins on the relationship of faith and evidence. Dawkins is absolutely clear what faith means. Here is a characteristically robust statement from The Selfish Gene. Faith, he writes, means blind trust in the absence of evidence, even in the teeth of evidence. And it seems to me this is a core belief, something that really saturates Dawkins' writings, that faith is simply a retreat from evidence. I've stressed already his emphasis on evidence-based thinking, and for Dawkins, faith involves running away from the evidence. And we see this in quote after quote. Here is another one. In this case, this is from a lecture given at the 1992 Edinburgh International Science Festival, where again you'll see faith is simply a refusal to think, a refusal to engage with the evidence. Faith, he writes, is not allowed to justify itself by argument. Or again, a later writing, very similar. Look at the last sentence in that quote. Faith, being belief that isn't based on evidence, is the principal vice of any religion. So I think there's a very important question to raise here. The relationship of proof and faith, the role of evidence in the way in which we think. And therefore I want to explore this and ask quite where he's coming from. I want to begin by asking where this definition of faith comes from. Let me repeat it. Faith means blind trust in the absence of evidence, even in the teeth of evidence. Interestingly, Dawkins does not offer a defense of this definition, nor does he source it from any religious writer. I don't know any Christian theologian, past or present, who would agree with that definition of faith. It cannot be defended from any official declaration of faith from any Christian denomination. It's Dawkins' own definition, constructed with his own agenda in mind, being represented as if it were characteristic of those he wishes to criticize. Let me give you an example. W.H. Griffith Thomas, an Anglican theologian, who I think it's fair to say none of you will ever have heard of. And I simply mention him as an example. Now you can tell he's an Anglican. If you look at that there, you'll see his definition has 3 points and they all begin with the same letter. But I would ask you to pause on the first of those points. Faith, he writes, commences with the conviction of the mind based on adequate evidence. And I could bore you by simply putting an endless series of extracts on the screen to make substantially the same point. I agree with Dawkins that any view that runs away from the evidence, that doesn't think, is to be excoriated. But it's not this. It's something else. And what I worry about is this facile identification of a straw man with what religious people actually think. It does seem to me to be rather unacceptable. Dawkins tends to take the view that religious faith is rather like believing in Santa Claus and the tooth fairy. When you grow up, you grow out of them all. But again, it's a curious example of a lack of evidence-based argumentation. What is the evidence that belief in Santa Claus, belief in the tooth fairy, and belief in God actually are generically isomorphous? The point I'd make to you is very simply this. I know lots of people, and indeed I am one of them myself, who believed in Santa Claus and the tooth fairy until an embarrassingly late age. But I didn't believe in God. That was a late discovery. And it's a simple fact that a large number of people discover God late in life. They're not the same at all. And I find this kind of a simplistic take on this really rather unsatisfactory. One of the most interesting points about Dawkins is the way in which he is able to move from his science to his atheism with such robustness and certainty. He is very, very clear that atheism is the only outcome from the sciences for any thinking person. But the question I want to raise is this. If the sciences are inferential in their methodology, how on earth can atheism, or indeed anything, be the certain outcome of a scientific project? Precisely because there is always going to be that degree of provisionality. This is what we think today, but tomorrow it may be different. We are governed by the available evidence, and that is a shifting quantity. We find a rather different attitude, for example, in Richard Feynman, a very famous quotation many of you will know, who argues that scientific knowledge is a body of statements of varying degree of certainty, some most unsure, some nearly sure, but none absolutely certain. And the ability to handle probabilistic judgments is essential to the scientific method. This is an article which I read some while ago, and it seems to me to be really helpful in trying to understand why it is that Dawkins proceeds from inference to the certainties of a worldview. And let me try and explain to you what Shanahan says. Shanahan argues that Dawkins inferentially proceeds to the conclusion that Darwinism is the best explanation of what we observe. Having reached that position, he then uses Darwinism as a secured starting point for a whole series of deductions about what the world may be like. So in effect, a position is inferred, and then from it, further conclusions are deduced. So it does seem to be a very interesting approach to methodology, which I think does need to be examined more closely. Now, clearly, there is much more that needs to be said about that, but you'll understand that there are some limits of space, and I really do need to keep moving on. So I want to move on, if I may, to this third point, which seems to me to be immensely important. The question of whether God is a virus or indeed a meme. What, you may ask, is a meme? Many of you will know, but let me explain for the benefit of those of you who do not. In researching this book, Dawkins' God, one of the things I noticed was that Dawkins' greatest impact on popular culture has been through precisely this concept of the meme. The meme is a cultural replicator, paralleling the gene in genetics. And Dawkins has done an enormous amount to popularize the concept and to make it accessible to a wider audience through his very simple terminology and illustrations. We find the idea back in the selfish gene, and interestingly, immediately is applied to a religious context. Dawkins talks about the God meme back in 1976, and of course develops this in subsequent writings. As Dawkins applies both the idea of God as a meme and God as a virus to his atheist worldview, I think it's very important to linger on this particular issue and see where it takes us. And I want to raise 4 problems about memes. I will mention what they are, and then we'll look at them in more detail. First of all, there is a serious question about whether cultural evolution can be thought of as being Darwinian at all, or indeed that evolutionary biology really has any particular value in relationship to the history of ideas. A second point, and again I think this is quite important given this emphasis on evidence-based judgment, there is no evidence, no direct experimental evidence for the existence of memes themselves. Thirdly, the case for the existence of the meme back in 1976 and subsequently rests on an analogy with the gene, but the analogy proves incapable of bearing the weight that Dawkins is obliged to place upon it. And fourthly, a very simple point from the standpoint of scientific explanation, whereas with the gene you had to propose it to explain what you observed, with the meme, the observational data can be explained perfectly well without the need for invoking the meme at all. Let's begin to look at each of these points because they do demand careful consideration. I want to begin by asking, is cultural development, cultural evolution, Darwinian? Certainly when I was beginning to study the history of ideas back in 1978, I found Dawkins' idea of the meme immensely intriguing. It seemed to me here was a way of approaching the evolution of ideas which was far more satisfactory than any of the models I'd noticed in the humanities. It seemed to me to have scientific rigor, and certainly for me, Dawkins' meme was going to be a valuable tool in looking at the development of ideas. Now, I have to say that after some time I began to wonder about this, and it might be good just to look at some of the difficulties that emerged. And one of them can be seen very clearly simply by looking at the Renaissance. We could look at many other events, episodes in cultural history. I've chosen this because it's very accessible, and many of you will know about it already. In the case of the Italian Renaissance, which became so influential in the 14th and 15th century, we see a classic case of cultural evolution. It involves the reappropriation of the past. Not simply reappropriation, but redirection reshaping, remolding. In other words, taking old ideas, old values, and giving them a new lease of life. It is a fascinating area for the intellectual historian. But that reappropriation of the past was deliberate, intentional, and planned. In other words, those who were concerned to advance the Renaissance were quite clear that they were doing this deliberately. And the real difficulty is that that points to Lamarckian rather than Darwinian conceptions of evolution, if it points to anything. But more likely, it simply means that evolutionary biology may not really have much relevance to cultural development at all. Let's move on to this question. Do memes actually exist? Now, Dawkins talks about this in his preface to Susan Blackmore's book, The Meme Machine, published in 1999. And Dawkins very honestly lays out some problems that he is aware of in relation to the hypothesis. He considers some objections. For example, we don't know what memes are made of or where they reside. Memes haven't yet found their Watson or Crick. They even lack their Mendel. Whereas genes are to be found in precise locations on chromosomes, memes presumably, again, notice the hesitation there, presumably exist in brains. And we have even less chance of seeing one than of seeing the gene. Though the neurobiologist Joan Delius has pictured his conjecture of what a meme might look like. The real point here is that there is no compelling evidence to believe in these things at all. I mean, Dawkins here makes the point that Juan Delius has pictured his conjecture of what a meme might look like. But what's the evidential force of that? Look at this. There's William Blake, the Ancient of Days. That's what Blake thinks God looks like. So because someone can picture something, it exists. You know, there's just a question or two that I think really do need to raise there. There are some serious points that I think need to be made here. Genes, for example, can be seen. Their transmission patterns can be studied under rigorous empirical conditions. What may have started off as hypothetical constructs inferred from systematic experiment and observation ended up by being observed themselves. But the real problem is that memes are hypothetical constructs which are inferred from observation. It turns out they are unobservable, and it also turns out, at least in my view, that they serve little explanatory purpose. And therefore there are some questions, I think, that I would want to raise. Particularly, I want to look at this point in some detail, the analogy which leads Dawkins to make this point. In The Selfish Gene and elsewhere, Dawkins makes a lot of the need for analogical argumentation in the sciences. It's a good point. It's a fair point. This seems to be like this. Let's propose it is so and see if we can find the hypothetical entities that are implicated in that process of analogical predication. But the real difficulty is that the analogy doesn't really seem to work. You can see the analogy there. Biological evolution requires a replicator, now known to exist, which we call the gene. So by analogy, cultural evolution also requires a replicator, which is hypothesized to be the meme. Now again, the real issue here, I think, is simply that analogical argumentation is always going to be somewhat loose in terms of its thinking. You can think, for example, of 19th century physics, which entertained itself enormously by imagining that there was an analogy between light and sound. The assumption that both required a medium led to certain conclusions being drawn, which eventually were shown to be incorrect. An analogy may seem to exist, but of course it does require to be verified. Simon Conway Morris, based locally, does comment on this. He writes, memes are trivial, to be banished by simple mental exercises. In any wider context, they are hopelessly, if not hilariously, simplistic. To conjure up memes not only reveals a strange imprecision of thought, but as Antonio here has remarked, if memes really existed, they would ultimately deny the reality of reflective thought. An extract there from Life's Solution, page 324. And I think the real difficulty, as Martin Gardner pointed out in a review in the Los Angeles Times, is that a meme is so broadly defined by its proponents that it actually is a fairly useless concept. And he goes on to argue that basically whatever can be explained by memes can be explained in other, perhaps less attractive, but nevertheless more economical ways. So I want to raise questions about the meme itself, but also, of course, in relation to the use that Dawkins makes of this concept in relation to his approach to religious belief. And this, I think, is seen in particular in relation to the idea of God as a virus, which I think is best seen as an extension of the meme notion. Again, the argument is this. It is not that the case for God is intellectually compelling. It is that there exists a cultural replicator, or now a virus, which is particularly adept at infecting people. The efficacy does not lie in the merits of the argument for God, but in some hypotheticated entity which is able to transmit this with unusual efficiency. And therefore Dawkins argues that God can be thought of as a virus, something that infects people's minds. And of course, the idea that God is such a virus has had quite a deep impact on popular atheist writing. The basic argument is that God is a virus who is spread from one individual to another in a manner which is at least in some way analogous to epidemiology. But again, we might pause and ask, for example, what is the experimental evidence for such a hypothetical virus of the mind? Because in the real world, viruses are not known simply by their symptoms or by their patterns of diffusion, but by being detectable, subjected to rigorous empirical investigation, and their genetic structure being characterized. Again, in contrast, the idea that God, or indeed anything, is a virus of the mind is hypothetical. It's posited by a questionable analogical argument rather than direct observation. And it does seem to me that Dawkins leaves himself open to the suggestion that there is an atheism virus, an atheism meme, as much as there is a God meme or a God virus. Because after all, atheism is a matter of faith as much as Christianity is. To try to summarize some concerns here. First of all, real viruses can be seen. For example, using cryo-electron microscopy. And there is a very famous example of a virus that you can look at in this way. Whereas Dawkins' cultural or religious viruses are simply unobserved hypotheses. There's no real observational evidence for their existence. Again, we might say that ideas behave in certain ways as if they were viruses, for example, in relation to the way in which they spread. But there is a massive gap between analogy and identity. And the history of science suggests very painfully that many false trails in science are about analogies that were mistakenly assumed to be identities. And third, the God as virus slogan seems to have more to do with the matter of how they are spread. But we don't really see evidence-based studies suggesting that there are parallels here. So I want to suggest that there is more work that might need to be done here. Aaron Lynch, many of you will know, for books like Thought Contagion. This quote is taken from his book, his article, An Introduction to the Evolutionary Epidemiology of Ideas, which appeared in the Biological Physicist last year. And he simply makes the point that if we can talk about thought contagion, it just doesn't help us identify what is a good idea, what is a bad idea, what is a true idea, what is a false idea. And really, it is very unhelpful in trying to identify what is going on. Here is Stephen Shannon writing towards the end of his book, Genes, Memes, and Human History. Shannon, interestingly, like myself, back in 1977, was convinced that the meme might be helpful in relation to intellectual or cultural history, and has since moved away from that. I think his conclusion is really about the best summary of the evidence you can hope for, namely that cultural inheritance exists, but its roots are different from the genetic ones. Now again, I've rushed through this, much more needs to be said, but I want to move on and look at this fourth issue that Dawkins raises. It's a very important issue. It's an aesthetic issue. Religion impoverishes our view of the universe. And he writes about this particularly in Unweaving the Rainbow. And here is a quote from that book, which makes the point very, very clearly, I think. The universe, he writes, is genuinely mysterious, grand, beautiful, awe-inspiring. But the kinds of views of the universe which religious people have traditionally embraced have been puny, pathetic, measly, in comparison to the way the universe actually is. The universe presented by organized religions is a poky little medieval universe and extremely limited. Now, it's a very interesting line of thought, but it does seem to me that the argument is more driven by rhetoric than by an evidential basis. I mean, we might look at this just to illustrate this. Here is, I assume, what Dawkins has in mind. It's a late medieval view of the universe from the Nuremberg Chronicle, and you can see it in more detail, which depicts the Ptolemaic vision of the solar system. And I have no doubt it has many deficiencies. And I have no doubt it is pokey in comparison to modern visions of the universe. But I can tell you that medieval writers were overwhelmed by this and, in effect, saw this as being absolutely magnificent. But I think I need to make a simple point. If medieval people believed in this, I'm afraid it was because this was the best the science of the day had to offer. And therefore, in effect, if a criticism may be directed against the medieval view of the universe, I'm afraid it does not need to be directed towards theologians, but rather towards Western culture as a whole, who quite happily accepted what they were being told by the physicists of the day. So it's a very general question about how a culture makes up its mind and the role of scientists in shaping that. So I think we just need to be a little bit careful here. What I want to do is to try and look at Dawkins' main lines of criticism and begin to offer some kind of response. And I want to do this by looking at how a Christian approach to nature identifies a sense of awe in response to what we observe. First of all, there is an immediate sense of wonder at the beauty of nature. It's evoked immediately. It's a kind of heart-stopping moment where you see a rainbow. Dawkins knows that and appreciates it. I have read Dawkins very carefully, but I just do not follow the argument at this point. I do not see why believing in God in any way diminishes one's appreciation of the beauty of nature at this point. Secondly, there is a derived sense of wonder at the mathematical or theoretical representation of reality that arises from this. Dawkins knows and approves of the second source of what he calls awed wonder, but he seems to imply that religious people, I quote, revel in mystery and feel cheated when it is explained. I have to say, maybe some do, but not the ones I know. And I just want again to raise a question about the reliability of that judgment. There is a third level, which I think does not really have a secular equivalent. And that is for the Christian who takes the view that the world is God's creation. There is a further derived sense of wonder at what the natural world points to. In other words, this very strong sense that the natural world is a signal or a pointer of something that lies beyond itself. An idea you find in many medieval theologians and scientists, and also in writers like C.S. Lewis. For example, Psalm 19 verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of the Lord. And for Christians, the experience of the beauty of creation is a sign or pointer to the glory of God. And as you will know, for Christians, this is a stimulus to study nature, a stimulus to do science. You may think, for example, of John Calvin, often thought to be a rather stern writer, who in effect says he wishes he was a physiologist or astronomer, that he might be able to points. I put a watercolor by William Blake on the screen some time ago. Let's come back to Blake, because for Dawkins, Blake is a very good example of the rather unacceptable approach to mystery that he sees in some religious writers. And he argues that the same impulses to awe, to reverence, to wonder, which led Blake to mysticism, are precisely those that lead others to science. And the point he then makes is that the interpretation may be different, but the experience is the same. Then he makes this point, again relating to Blake. The mystic is content to bask in the wonder and revel in a mystery that we were not meant to understand. The scientist feels the same wonder, but is restless, not content, recognizes the mystery of profound, and then says, we are working on it. So I can see there's a very important point being made there. But I do want, I think, to make an important point. That in Christian theology, the word mystery simply means something which is so big we cannot adequately describe it, even though it is rational and we may grasp at least something of it. And the point I want to make is that wrestling with a mystery, a very good way of describing the whole theological enterprise, does not mean we feel cheated if something is explained. It's much more that we are just grateful for those moments of illumination when they actually arrive. Charles Gore, 19th century Anglican writer, making this point. Human language can never adequately express divine realities. A constant tendency to apologize for human speech, a great element of agnosticism, an awful sense of unfathomed depths beyond the little is made known, is always present in the mind of theologians who know what they are about. There's a strong sense that, we have not got a big enough handle on what's out there. And then he gives some quotations from St. Paul in the New Testament and an early Christian writer to make the same point. What he's saying simply is, there is something out there that is so big that we do not fully apprehend it, but we do the best we can. A not entirely dissimilar trajectory of thought to the natural sciences. Now I come to the last point. Dawkins is very clear that religion is a bad thing. It's clear that that's both an intellectual and a moral judgment. And I want to try and explore this point because it seems to me to be very significant. What is the empirical evidence that religion is a bad thing? If we are going to use evidence-based modes of argumentation, well, what evidence, what empirical studies might be adduced to defend that? Well, Dawkins' answer is very straightforward. If you look at history, very interesting thing for a scientist to do, if you look at history, you'll see that religious people have done some awful things and continue to do so. Well, I agree with that. But I just want to make the point that today is the 15th anniversary of the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And you don't need to know a huge amount about the history of Eastern Europe, particularly the Soviet Union, in the 20th century to know that atheism actually hasn't been quite so good on this either. And so I just want to raise that, question. Is this about religion being a bad thing, atheism being a bad thing, or is it, as Nietzsche pointed out in the 1890s, something about human nature itself? Because Nietzsche's point is there's something odd about human nature which makes things that inspire it lead to wonderful things and appalling things, sometimes even in the same people. I wonder if the real problem here is not religion, not even atheism, but actually something about human nature itself. But I don't want to linger on that. I want instead to move on and simply make this point. Dawkins is very clear. Science has no methods for deciding what is ethical. But what about evidence-based studies? How might we determine that religion is bad empirically? Is religion actually pathological? Now, it's an interesting field of study which has mushroomed, as you will know, in the last decade. And it's one that I think does need to be looked at. There's a very substantial research field which is emerging. There is a useful discussion of the field, and there is a review of the whole area. They don't look at Christianity specifically. They're looking at religion and spirituality in very general terms. But increasingly, empirical studies are suggesting, I say suggest, I don't overstate, I say they suggest that actually religion may be positive in relation both to well-being and recovery. Let's look at this review of the field. Now, I hesitate to use this press in Cambridge, but it's quite recent and it will do. And again, I want to make the point, I'm not saying what I'm about to flash up on the screen proves anything. I'm very much aware of the limits of the methods I'm using. I'm certainly saying, though, this raises some difficult issues for discussion. Above all, this very simplistic idea, religion is bad view. What does this review say? Well, it looks at 100 evidence-based studies. And here is what the outcomes are. Many of you will know this. If you don't, you might like to look at it. 79 report at least one positive correlation between religious involvement and well-being. 13 were unable to discern any meaningful association. 7 found mixed or complex associations, and 1 found a negative association. This research is ongoing. And I stress, I'm not drawing any firm conclusions. But I am saying this doesn't point in Dawkins' direction at all. And I think there's a real need to open this whole area up. What if religion is actually good for you? And that is the question we are raising. It's a difficult question, it's controversial, but it needs to be looked at. For Dawkins, the issue is very simple. And there's a quote from his book, The Devil's Chaplain. The issue is whether you value health or truth. And his view is very simple, that really, because religion is based on falsehoods or deceit or misunderstandings, how on earth can you with integrity hold it? Therefore, the issue of whether it's good for you is just a side issue. But the point I want to make is that the core assumption that faith involves a retreat from evidence is one really that cannot be substantiated. Well, I've spoken for quite some time, and I think it's time for me to just wrap this up and open up for a time of questions. What I've tried to do in this lecture is to raise some questions. I'm very clear I've done nothing more than that. I'm enormously grateful to Richard Dawkins for opening up such a fascinating discussion. What is the role of evidence in science and faith? Is religion a good thing or a bad thing? A whole series of things here which he has opened up for our discussion. But I think it needs to be said, he has initiated a debate. He has certainly not closed it down. It seems to me that the question of whether there is a God and what that God ought to be like has not, despite the predictions of some Darwinians, gone away since Darwin and remains of major intellectual and personal importance. Scientists and theologians, in my view, have a lot to learn from each other. To quote from Richard Dawkins, right at the end of Unweaving the Rainbow, where he talks about the merit of people talking to each other. For example, Keats and Newton, he says, they might even hear the galaxies sing. Well, I wonder if they might even hear the heavens declaring the glory of the Lord, as Psalm 19 has it. So, to end simply with this point, there's a debate ongoing here. And what I've tried to do is simply open up some issues for discussion. It seems to me that some questions do need to be raised about, for example, whether Dawkins has entirely understood the idea of faith as used in religious contexts. Nonetheless, he raises interesting questions. I think the important thing is to make sure that discussion goes on rather than is shut down. Thank you so much for listening.